Hi, my name is Danielle Hausman. I'm an occupational therapist and rehab educator here at the Craig Nielsen Rehabilitation Hospital. Thank you so much for watching this video about the anatomy of the spinal cord. Please take a moment to pause the video and read over this important disclaimer. Thank you. Here are the objectives that we'll talk about in this video. We'll cover the basic anatomy of the spine. We'll talk about how the spinal cord is organized and how the spinal cord functions. So first we have the nervous system, which controls most things in our body. It consists of the brain stem, the spinal cord, and the spinal nerves that branch out to the specific muscles in our bodies. And the spinal nerves are also known as the peripheral nerves. The brain is the body's control center. It sends billions of messages all day long, from brain to spinal cord to the body, and then the reverse, from the body to the spinal cord, back up to the brain. And the spinal column is made up of vertebrae, and the vertebrae are the bones that are in our back. And the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae, but sometimes during times of trauma, the vertebrae can't quite handle the amount of trauma, and then the vertebrae can end up hurting the spinal cord rather than protecting it. And in between each of the vertebrae is a disc, and the disc is meant to stop the bones from rubbing together and is also meant to absorb any trauma that happens. So the vertebrae from top to bottom is broken into several different sections. So first in the neck, we have the cervical vertebrae, and there are 7 of those bones. Next is the thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 of them. Below that are the lumbar vertebrae. There are 5, and then at the very bottom is the tailbone. And in this drawing, you can see how the vertebrae align with all of the other bones in the body. So each vertebrae has a hole in it, and the purpose of that hole is for the spinal cord to pass through. This is called the spinal canal, and this is how the spinal cord is protected. So in the lower picture, you can see the vertebrae, or the bone, and the contents if you were to snap the back down the middle. So that large oval pink thing, that is the disc. That's meant to absorb trauma or help to absorb trauma. And next to it, that really small object is the spinal cord. I think it's kind of surprising how small it is considering how important it is in our bodies. And then those things that branch out on the side that look just like branches, almost like from a tree, those are the nerve roots for the spinal nerves, which are also known as the peripheral nerves. So the main job of the spinal cord is to communicate between the brain and the rest of the body. And the spinal cord is a long rope-like bundle of nerves that's really skinny, just about the width of the average person's pinky. And as you can see in this picture, it ends towards the top of the lumbar spine in our mid to low backs. And at the very bottom, the spinal cord looks like a horse's tail. So it's called the quadra equina. And as you can see, it looks like a horse's tail because it's made up of more individually splayed nerves as opposed to being the tightly wound part of the spinal cord. And we also like to talk about the blood supply of the spinal cord, that for being so important, it's kind of surprising that the spinal cord doesn't have a more supportive blood supply. So there's one main artery in the front of the spinal cord and 2 main arteries in the back, and then other smaller supportive arteries along the sides. So sometimes during times of trauma, if there's even just a small cutoff to the blood supply of the spinal cord, that can contribute to the deficits that we see. And there's different types of messages that different nerves convey. There are sensory messages, which are all about sensation and feeling, temperature, like being able to tell the difference between hot and cold, touch, pain, pressure, and knowing where your body is in space. Next, we have motor messages, which tell the muscles when and how to move. So sometimes it can be different on one side of your body versus the other. In other words, you might be able to feel more on one side of your body, but move more on the other side. But sometimes it is symmetrical or the same. There are also reflex messages, and a reflex message is when our body reacts to a stimulus that doesn't go up to our brains. So the example that you can see in this picture is if you were to touch something that's hot, your arm would automatically pull away without you having to think about it. It's an automatic reflex response. Another example of a reflex message would be spasticity. So spasticity is when a muscle moves out of our control. It's not a voluntary action. It happens automatically. And in this picture, we can see how the vertebrae aligns with the spinal cord itself. And there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So starting at the top, we have the cervical spinal nerves. And one main difference here between the spinal cord and the cervical vertebrae is that there are 8 pairs of spinal nerves, but only 7 vertebrae or 7 bones in the neck. And so the 8th pair of cervical spinal nerves exits the spinal cord just at the bottom of the neck and above the thoracic section. And then next we have the thoracic and the lumbar spinal nerves. Next, we'll talk about each section of the spinal cord and what it controls. So the cervical spinal nerves are in our neck, and they are responsible for controlling arms, hands, fingers, and many of the breathing muscles, such as the diaphragm. And the thoracic spinal nerves make up the largest section of the spinal cord. The top half is largely responsible for controlling chest muscles, while the lower half is responsible for controlling stomach muscles. So these muscles are important for being able to generate a good, strong cough and also for maintaining your balance while in a seated position. Below that area are the lumbar spinal nerves, and they control legs and hips. And at the very bottom, we have the sacral spinal nerves, and they control not only legs and feet, but also bowel, bladder, and sexual organs. So we know that the brain and spinal cord work together to control most things in our body, and that the spinal cord has a protective mechanism, the vertebrae, but sometimes the vertebrae can end up hurting the spinal cord by pinching it rather than protecting it. And we know that specific areas of the spinal cord are responsible for controlling very specific body movements and feeling. Please contact your primary care team with any questions that you might have about this information. Thank you for watching the video.